Welcome back, everybody. We are about to talk about the second part of imagery, which is the interaction between imagery and perception. And this is based in part on what we talked about with regard to the spatial mechanisms piece from part one. So if we're thinking about spatial mechanisms and this sort of analog representation of the real world and our mental image, it leads to a couple of really interesting questions. The first being that if perception and imagery share common cognitive processes, then it seems like one should interfere with the other. For example, it seems like trying to remember a song while one is playing should be really difficult because the modality of your auditory channels are filled up with perceiving a current song, so it makes it hard to then mentally imagine another song. Alternatively, can it work the other direction? So meaning if I am imagining the song Happy Birthday, is it going to be difficult for me, or will I be less likely to perceive something playing on the radio? So that is the question for the part of this lecture. So back in the 60s, Brooks set about trying to test this idea, and he did this using a mental letter block, meaning that the subjects had to conjure up in mind a mental image of a particular block letter. For the example that we're talking about here, it's going to be the letter L. So all of these different responses I'm going to be referring to are referring to one having a picture of a block letter L in mind. So what he would ask people to do is conjure this letter, and then he would ask them to do one of three different testing tasks. The first one would be a vocal response. So as a person mentally traversed the different corners of the letter L, they would say, now, 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 now. That would be recorded for reaction time. Alternatively, if they had a tapping response, they would use their left and their right hands, and they would go around the block tapping yes, 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 as they got to each corner of the letter. Alternatively, there was a complex sheet that I will show you in a minute where as they would mentally go around this letter, they would circle on this answer sheet yeses or nos. So the idea was, I have this mental picture in mind of this block letter that I'm either going to respond vocally, I'm going to respond with a motor movement like the tapping, or I'm going to respond using something that was similar to the letter L, which is looking at letters on a sheet, visual. And results turned out as you would expect, researchers expected, was that having a person hold a mental image of something visual, like the letter L, also made it difficult for them to also process a visual complex worksheet, as you can see here at the bottom right. So people were much slower in that condition to point at the yes or no responses while holding a visual mental image. So that suggests that visual imagery and visual perception, one interfered with the other. The other thing that made this slower is that looking at the letter L and looking at Y's and N's were the same target category of letters, which also made people slow down. Another study tried to look at this idea of interference in another way. In this case, we're looking to see whether or not imagery can maybe interfere with perception. So here you can see that the woman is supposed to be imagining, that's the little cloud-looking thing, the letter H. After imagining a particular letter, she would be holding that in mind, and then she would be presented with two subsequent screens, one that would be blank, one that would have a target letter, and then she had to determine whether the target letter was flashed, and these were done very quickly, in the first screen or the second screen, and this alternated. The other thing that alternated is the item letter that she was imagining could either be consistent or inconsistent with the target letter. So in the case that you're looking at here, the inconsistent image of the letter H held in mind made people slower and made more errors to determine where the target letter was shown, suggesting that the mental image of the letter H had interfered with the processing of the perceptual letter T. So another follow-up study looking at this idea of mental imagery and perceptions interaction was Siegel and Fusella. And the task here was simple detection, meaning do you see it, do you not, do you hear it, do you not? What they had subjects do is they were asked to create either a visual or an auditory image, so either a sound of something or a visual picture. So they're holding this in mind. And then they would be presented with either a faint sound or a faint icon that would be flashed very quickly, or there was a control condition. And either the perceptual flash or faint sound was consistent or inconsistent with the image they had in mind, meaning that if it's consistent, I'm holding a picture of something in mind, and you're also asking me to respond whether or not I see this faint image presented. So you can see from the results here that when you look at the mental imagery condition along the bottom, that is either consistent or inconsistent with what was presented for the perceptual signal. So you can see for the auditory imagery, people were much less sensitive, meaning it was more difficult for them to detect another auditory signal, whereas if the signal was visual and they had an auditory image in mind, they were really good at detecting it, suggesting that it's not about having any mental image and any perception that creates the problem. The issue is it has to be in the same modality to create the problem, meaning that the cognitive processes for dealing with auditory information, be it perceptual or imagined, and visual information, being it perceptual or imagined, seem to be using the same processes because one can interfere with the other. What do we know about the neuropsychological aspects of imagery versus perception? And we have some evidence from stroke patients that visual neglect, which if you remember was people ignoring one half of their body, one half of a visual field. We had talked about this previously in another lecture. Whether or not they also suffer from what's called imagery neglect, meaning are they only imagining half of a visual field? So some Italian researchers did a really cool study where they had patients who were dealing with visual neglect who had grown up in an area where they had been inside this Piazza del Duomo many times. And they asked them to picture themselves at the front of the door of the piazza and walk from the door up to the front. And in doing that, they asked them to describe everything that they saw in their mental image. And in doing that, they could report everything they saw on the right side. And then they asked them to mentally turn around and walk back to the door. And in doing that, they could report everything that was on the left side now, but they could not report everything that was on the right side, although they had just reported that earlier. So it suggests that these sort of issues that we see with perceptual information is also an issue with the imagined information, suggesting that people also show imagery neglect when they show visual neglect, suggesting again that the perceptual and imagined processing systems are intertwined. So other studies looking at imagery in the brain find that if there is an area in the brain that is fired most actively when shown an object like the baseball, but not when looking at the human face, we find a similar pattern in imagining a baseball or an object here, but not in imagining a face. So as we've talked about this before, where different parts of the brain seem to respond different to different types of stimuli, we find the same thing whether it's in perception or in imagining those sorts of stimuli. There are also some disassociations between imagery and perception. So your book talks about this a little bit. There are patients, one in particular, RM, who he had imagery issues. So he had damage to occipital and parietal lobes. And with this sort of damage, he could draw accurate pictures of objects in front of him. However, he could not use imagery to draw a picture. So he had perception, but seemingly damaged imagery abilities. Alternatively, CK had perceptual issues. So he could not name pictures of objects in front of him. Like when he was shown an asparagus, that I have a picture here, he would call it rose twig with thorns. So it's not like he couldn't see it, he just couldn't name it. However, he could draw objects in detail from memory using imagery. So his imagination was fine. So the idea here is that we have bottom-up and top-down processing, where our lower order parts of the visual system are tied to perception. So if someone has damage in that part of the system, then they're going to have perceptual problems. Whereas imagery, to conjure an image, you have to access memory storage, pull up an imagined item, and then make decisions about it. So higher order processing, more top-down, where there is damage closer to the top-down higher order processing ends of the mental processes, that's where you find imagery deficits. So that is all we have for imagery. You should take away from this lecture that perception and imagery are interactive and seemingly two parts of a similar system.